When an arrogant thug assaulted a paralyzed Marine at the tomb of the unknown soldier, he never expected the stone-faced honor guard to move. But a single lightning-fast strike taught him more about honor than a lifetime of lectures. Here's the incredible story that unfolded that day. The crisp autumn air hung heavy with anticipation at Arlington National Cemetery, where 624 acres of hallowed ground bore silent witness to generations of American sacrifice. Dawn had barely broken over the horizon, painting the endless rows of white marble headstones in shades of amber and gold. At the tomb of the unknown soldier, where silence traditionally reigned supreme, the sacred morning stillness was about to be shattered by an act of unthinkable disrespect. Private First Class Michael Torres stood at his post, executing the meticulous 21-step routine that honor guards have performed without interruption since 1937. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His movements were precise, practiced to perfection over countless hours. Exactly 21 steps south, face east for 21 seconds, face north for 21 seconds. Take 21 steps down the mat, face east for 21 seconds. The polished M14 rifle rested perfectly on his shoulder, every angle exact, every motion synchronized to the second. Even after 8 months of serving at this post, the weight of responsibility still pressed upon him like a physical force. The early morning tourists watched in respectful silence, their phones lowered in deference to the signs requesting no photography during the ceremony. The changing of the guard would begin in exactly 17 minutes, and already small groups of visitors gathered in hushed anticipation. Among them, several veterans stood with straight backs and solemn expressions, some wearing caps displaying their units and years of service, others identifiable only by their bearing and the look in their eyes that spoke of battles long past. Among the gathering crowd, Marcus Chen sat quietly in his titanium wheelchair, his Purple Heart and Silver Star catching the early light. The former Force Recon Marine had made this pilgrimage every year since returning from Fallujah with a severed spine. 10 years later, at age 35, his military bearing remained evident in his straight posture and alert eyes, even if his legs could no longer carry him. His wife Sarah had offered to accompany him as she did every year, but this morning he'd needed to come alone, to sit with his thoughts and remember the men who hadn't made it back, particularly Lance Corporal James Rodriguez, whose sacrifice had earned Marcus both his medals and his wheelchair. The sanctity of the moment was first broken by the sound of expensive leather shoes scraping carelessly against stone. Ryan Blake, fresh from an all-night bender at Georgetown's exclusive clubs, stumbled toward the memorial. His custom Italian suit, now wrinkled and stained with what appeared to be expensive scotch, spoke of old money and newer arrogance. At 27, he'd already burned through 3 hedge funds with his father's connections cleaning up each mess. The silver flask protruding from his pocket suggested this morning would bring another mess entirely. What's this, some kind of fancy funeral home? Blake's voice carried too loud across the hallowed ground, making several visitors wince. He swayed slightly, catching himself on a nearby railing, his Rolex flashing in the morning light. Look at this guy, he gestured wildly at Private Torres, playing soldier like it's a Halloween party. Bet he couldn't hack it in a real job. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, parents pulling children closer, veterans in the audience straightening instinctively at the disruption. An elderly man wearing a Vietnam veteran cap shook his head slowly, while a young mother tried to distract her curious daughter from the unfolding scene. Marcus remained still, but his weathered hands gripped his wheelchair's arms slightly tighter, years of combat experience telling him this situation could escalate rapidly. Private Torres maintained his vigilant routine, each step measured and precise, though something in his bearing suggested he was acutely aware of the growing tension. 21 steps. Turn. 21 steps. The morning sun glinted off his bayonet as he executed another perfect turn. His training had prepared him for distractions, from weather to wildlife to disruptive visitors, but the rising tension in the air was palpable even through his disciplined focus. Blake, encouraged by the lack of immediate consequences, stepped closer to the restricted area. His expensive shoes scuffed the immaculate marble as he leaned against a barrier, leaving smudges that the cemetery's dedicated groundskeepers would later have to clean. "Hey, G.I. Joe," he called out, his words slurring slightly. "Do they pay you extra to play statue? Or is this some kind of community service? Come on, at least blink or something." A nearby mother quickly ushered her young children away, while an elderly veteran shook his head in dismay, his weathered hands clenching into fists at his sides. The air grew thick with tension as Blake continued his tirade, each word a desecration of the sacred space. Private Torres remained focused on his duty, though those who looked closely might have noticed his grip tighten ever so slightly on his rifle, the only outward sign of his awareness of the situation. Marcus wheeled himself forward slowly, positioning himself between Blake and an elderly couple who appeared increasingly distressed by the disruption. His voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet authority of someone used to commanding respect in far more dangerous situations than this. The morning light caught his metals again, a silent testament to his sacrifice and service. "Son," he addressed Blake calmly, "this is a place of honor and remembrance. Perhaps we could step away and discuss what's troubling you? There are better ways to spend your morning than disturbing this sacred ground." Blake's bloodshot eyes fixed on Marcus, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he found what he considered an easier target. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps as he took a stumbling step toward the wheelchair-bound Marine, completely unaware that his next actions would trigger a chain of events that would change his life forever. Blake's attention now fully fixed on Marcus, his expensive suit rustling as he straightened up in what he probably thought was an intimidating pose. The morning air had grown noticeably colder, or perhaps it was just the chill of what was about to unfold. The silver flask slipped from his pocket, clattering against the marble steps with a sound that echoed through the sacred space like a gunshot. "Oh, look who's trying to be a hero," Blake sneered, his words dripping with privileged contempt. "What's the matter, Wheels? Couldn't find a VA hospital to hang out at?" He took another stumbling step forward, his Italian leather shoes leaving scuff marks on the pristine stone. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible, a sharp hiss of shock at such blatant disrespect. Marcus remained perfectly still, his military training evident in his controlled response. His eyes, which had seen the worst of combat in Fallujah, assessed Blake with the calm precision of a seasoned warrior. The Purple Heart on his chest caught the morning light again, a silent testament to sacrifices that someone like Blake could never understand. "You know what I see?" Blake continued, emboldened by the alcohol coursing through his system. "I see a bunch of people playing pretend. Him with his fancy rifle routine." He gestured wildly at Private Torres, who continued his precise movements without visible reaction. "And you with your little medals and sob story." He kicked his own fallen flask aside, sending it skittering across the hallowed ground. Several phones had emerged from pockets now, their cameras capturing what was unfolding. An older veteran in a Korean war cap started to step forward, but his wife held him back, her aged hand gentle but firm on his arm. The tension in the air was becoming unbearable, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. "Young man," Marcus's voice remained steady, reasonable. "I understand you're having a difficult morning, but this isn't the place for this kind of behavior. These grounds deserve respect. Those who rest here paid the ultimate price for the very freedom you're currently abusing." Blake's face contorted at this, something ugly flickering across his features. "Respect?" He spat the word like it was poison. "You want to talk about respect? My father pays more in taxes in a month than this whole cemetery probably costs to run. If anything, you should be respecting me." He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a wad of crumpled $100 bills. "Here, how much does respect cost these days?" The money scattered in the morning breeze, green rectangles drifting across the white marble like leaves. Several tourists gasped, and a child started to cry somewhere in the crowd. Private Torres continued his measured pace, 21 steps, turn, 21 steps, but there was a new tension in his shoulders, visible only to those who knew what to look for. "Money doesn't buy respect," Marcus replied, his calm voice carrying across the now silent plaza. "It's earned through actions, through sacrifice, through service to something greater than yourself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Every soul resting in these grounds understood that. Blake's laughter was harsh, grating against the solemnity of the surroundings. Service? Sacrifice? Give me a break. You got yourself hurt playing soldier, and now you wheel around guilt-tripping people into feeling sorry for you. Well, I don't buy it. He stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space. And your friend over there with his rifle? He's just a minimum-wage security guard in a fancy costume. The insult to the honor guard seemed to affect Marcus more than the personal attacks. His hands tightened slightly on his wheelchair's arms, the only sign that Blake's words had registered at all. Behind them, Private Torres executed another perfect turn, his movements a study in controlled precision. The Tomb Guard badge is the second least awarded badge in the military, Marcus stated quietly. The men and women who serve here train for months to earn the honor. They maintain their watch in all weather at all hours without fail. Since 1937, this tomb has never been unguarded, not for storms, not for hurricanes, not even for terrorist attacks. Well, isn't that just special? Blake mockingly clasped his hands together. Tell me something, Wheels. If they're so elite, how come your guard buddy over there just stands there while I do this? Without warning, he grabbed a handful of his discarded money from the ground and threw it directly at Private Torres. The bills fluttered through the air, some landing on the carefully maintained path where the guard walked his 21 steps. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Even Marcus's composure cracked slightly, his eyes narrowing at the deliberate desecration. Private Torres maintained his post, though the money now littered his sacred path. The morning sun cast long shadows across the scattered bills, a stark symbol of the clash between materialism and sacrifice unfolding before the tomb of the unknown soldier. You see? Blake spread his arms wide, addressing the crowd now. It's all for show. All this ceremony, all this tradition, it's just theater for tourists. Your soldier boy there can't even bend down to pick up free money. Some elite warrior he is. His voice grew louder with each word, echoing off the marble columns. And you? He turned back to Marcus, swaying slightly. You're just part of the act, wheeling around in your chair, showing off your medals, playing the wounded hero. The air itself seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, the tension building like a pressure cooker about to explode. Private Torres continued his unwavering vigil, his discipline a stark contrast to Blake's increasing volatility. The scene was set for a confrontation that would soon teach everyone present an unforgettable lesson about real respect, real sacrifice, and real consequences. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays catching the scattered bills that littered the sacred ground like fallen leaves. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the commotion, though they maintained a respectful distance from the unfolding scene. Parents shielded their children's eyes, veterans stood with clenched jaws, and dozens of phones recorded what was quickly becoming a powder keg waiting to explode. You know what's funny? Blake continued, emboldened by his perceived dominance of the situation. My grandfather was a general, World War II veteran. He used to tell me stories about real soldiers. He emphasized the word real with obvious contempt, gesturing between Marcus and Private Torres. Not like you two, playing dress-up and looking for sympathy. Marcus's expression remained composed, though something flickered in his eyes at the mention of Blake's grandfather. If your grandfather was indeed a general, then you're dishonoring his legacy right now. He would understand the significance of this place, the weight of sacrifice it represents. Blake's face darkened at this, his alcohol-fueled bravado momentarily cracking to reveal something uglier underneath. Don't you dare talk about my grandfather, he snarled, taking another aggressive step forward. You don't know anything about legacy. My family built this country while people like you just play soldier. An older man in the crowd, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, whispered to his wife, that boy's grandfather would be turning in his grave right now. His wife squeezed his arm, noticing how his artificial leg tensed beneath his pants, understanding his urge to intervene. Private Torres continued his measured patrol, each step precise despite the money and debris now littering his path. The sun glinted off his bayonet with each turn like a warning beacon. Though his face remained impassive, those who looked closely might have noticed a slight tightening around his eyes, the only visible sign of his awareness of the deteriorating situation. "You want to know something about real sacrifice?" Marcus spoke quietly, but his voice carried across the now silent plaza. "The unknown soldier buried here represents every service member who gave everything, including their identity, for this nation. They serve as a reminder that sacrifice isn't about recognition or reward. It's about duty, honor, and love of country." Blake's laugh was ugly, echoing off the marble columns. "Love of country? Please. You got yourself crippled for what? Oil? Politics? And now you sit here in your chair, showing off your medals like they mean something." He kicked another scattered bill toward Marcus. "Here's what your sacrifice is worth in the real world." The tension in the air was becoming unbearable. Several veterans in the crowd had moved closer, their faces hard with contained anger. A young mother quickly guided her children away, whispering gentle explanations about respect and dignity. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "The chair doesn't define me, son," Marcus stated calmly, though his knuckles had whitened slightly on the armrests. "Just like that suit doesn't define you. It's our actions that show who we are. Right now, you're showing everyone here exactly what kind of man you've chosen to be." This seemed to strike a nerve. Blake's face flushed red, his expensive cologne not quite masking the smell of stale alcohol as he leaned down, getting in Marcus's face. "Chosen to be? I'll show you exactly who I am. Unlike you, I can actually stand up for myself." He straightened up, swaying slightly, and turned to address the crowd with theatrical flair. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Arlington's greatest show. On my left, we have the world's most expensive statue." He gestured mockingly at Private Torres. "And on my right, we have a professional victim who can't even stand up for himself anymore." The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible. Even those who had been trying to ignore the situation now turned to watch, horror and anger mixing on their faces. A young Army lieutenant in dress uniform had appeared at the edge of the gathering, speaking quietly into a radio, but any official intervention would come too late to prevent what was about to unfold. "You know what your problem is?" Blake continued, his voice rising with each word. "You think that chair and those medals make you special. You think everyone should bow down and respect you just because you got yourself hurt playing hero. Well, guess what? I'm not buying your act." Marcus remained still, his calm presence a stark contrast to Blake's increasing agitation. "This isn't about me, son. This is about respecting what this place represents. Every headstone here tells a story of sacrifice, of service, of—" "Shut up!" Blake's shout echoed across the plaza, startling several nearby birds into flight. "Just shut up with your lectures about sacrifice. You want to talk about sacrifice?" His face twisted into something ugly as he grabbed the handles of Marcus's wheelchair. "Let's see how well you lecture from the ground." The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps as Blake's hands tightened on the wheelchair's handles, his intentions becoming horrifyingly clear. Private Torres maintained his vigil. 21 steps turned 21 steps, but there was a new tension in his movements, like a coiled spring about to release. The crowd watched in horrified silence, knowing they were about to witness something that would change multiple lives forever. Time seemed to slow as Blake's alcohol-fueled rage reached its breaking point. His manicured hands gripped the wheelchair's handles with white-knuckled intensity, expensive watch glinting in the morning sun. The crowd's collective gasp was like a wave, rolling across the sacred ground as they realized what was about to happen. "Let's see how tough you are without this chair," Blake snarled, his privilege-packed worldview finally finding its violent expression. With a grunt of effort, he yanked backward, forcing the wheelchair up onto its back wheels. Marcus gripped the armrests, his combat-trained muscles tensing, but physics were against him. "Son, this is your last warning." Marcus's voice remained steady, even as his center of gravity shifted dangerously. "Think very carefully about what you're doing." His metals caught the light one final time before Blake's actions passed the point of no return. Several phones recorded the moment in high definition as Blake gave a final vicious shove. The wheelchair tipped past its balance point, sending Marcus sprawling onto the hard marble ground. His metals made a harsh metallic sound as they struck the stone, the purple heart skittering across the ground like a fallen leaf. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" Blake stood over the fallen Marine, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained with the evidence of his all-night bender. "Look, everyone!" he called out to the horrified crowd, spreading his arms wide. "Your hero can't even get up!" The gathered visitors stood frozen in shock, their faces reflecting a mixture of horror, anger, and disbelief. The young Army lieutenant was now running toward the scene, but he was still too far away to intervene. Private Torres continued his measured pace, 21 steps, turn, but something had changed in his bearing, a subtle shift that veterans in the crowd immediately recognized. Marcus pushed himself up onto his elbows, his military training evident in his composed response to the assault. Despite his position on the ground, his dignity remained intact, his eyes locked onto Blake with the steady gaze of someone who had faced far worse than a drunken bully. "Feel better now?" Marcus asked quietly, his calm voice carrying across the silent plaza. "Did assaulting a disabled veteran make you feel like a big man? What would your grandfather, the general, say if he could see you now?" Blake's face contorted with rage. "I told you not to talk about my grandfather." He drew back his foot, designer shoe poised to strike. You want to know what he'd say? He'd say. The foot started its forward arc toward Marcus's ribs. That's when it happened. The sound of measured footsteps suddenly quickened, a subtle change that cut through the tension like a knife. Private Torres had deviated from his century-old routine, his movements now carrying the fluid precision of a combat veteran, rather than a ceremonial guard. Before Blake's kick could connect, a white-gloved hand clamped onto his shoulder with devastating efficiency. The guard's other hand caught his kicking leg in mid-motion, using Blake's own momentum to send him sprawling onto the marble steps. The movement was precise, controlled, and spoke of years of combat training far beyond ceremonial duties. "On your feet," Private Torres commanded, his voice carrying the steel of battlefield authority. The ceremonial guard was gone, replaced by the combat soldier underneath. His perfect posture remained, but now it radiated coiled power rather than ritual precision. Blake, sprawled on the ground, looked up in shock at the guard he'd dismissed as a statue. The morning sun glinted off Torres's badges, not just ceremonial honors, but combat infantry and special forces tabs that spoke of experience far beyond the tomb plaza. But you can't," Blake stammered, his alcohol-addled brain struggling to process this deviation from his expectations. "You're supposed to just stand there. You're not allowed to." "Article 127 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice," Torres cut him off, his voice carrying the weight of law and tradition. "The right and responsibility to intervene in the face of criminal assault." His white gloves, still immaculate despite the takedown, contrasted sharply with Blake's now dusty suit. The crowd had drawn back, forming a perfect circle around the scene. Several veterans nodded in approval, understanding the significance of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a guard-breaking ceremony, this was the true spirit of the honor guard's duty being fulfilled. "You assaulted a decorated Marine veteran on hallowed ground," Torres continued, his voice carrying across the now silent plaza. "Did you think we would simply watch? Did you believe our duty was just ceremonial?" Each word carried the weight of every guard who had ever walked the 21 steps, of every unknown soldier resting beneath the marble. Blake tried to scramble to his feet, but Torres's grip remained firm. "Let me go." "Do you know who my father is? I'll have your job for this. The rest of his threat was cut off by a precise twist of his arm, not enough to damage, but more than enough to command his complete attention. "Your father's name carries no weight here," Torres stated quietly. "This ground was consecrated by the blood and sacrifice of better men than you'll ever be." His ceremonial rifle remained perfectly positioned across his shoulder, even as he controlled Blake with his other hand, a testament to the honor guard's incredible discipline. The morning sun now illuminated the scene in full daylight, casting no shadows in which dishonor could hide. Torres's intervention had taken less than 5 seconds, but its impact would echo far longer. The next few moments would teach Blake and everyone watching an unforgettable lesson about the true meaning of honor, duty, and respect. Private Torres maintained his disciplined hold on Blake, the contrast between his pristine uniform and Blake's disheveled state stark in the morning light. The silence that had fallen over the plaza was absolute, broken only by the soft whir of phone cameras capturing every moment of this unprecedented scene. "Stand up," Torres commanded, his voice carrying the same precision as his 21 steps. When Blake hesitated, a slight adjustment of pressure made him quickly comply. "Face the man you assaulted." Blake stumbled to his feet, his expensive suit now covered in marble dust, his previously arrogant demeanor crumbling under the reality of his situation. The young Army lieutenant had finally reached them, accompanied by 2 military police officers who had been patrolling nearby. "Sir," Torres addressed the lieutenant while maintaining his hold on Blake, "this individual assaulted a disabled veteran on sacred ground. He deliberately desecrated the tomb plaza and attempted to cause grievous bodily harm." Meanwhile, several veterans from the crowd had carefully helped Marcus back into his wheelchair. Their movements were precise and respectful, the kind of assistance one warrior offers another. Marcus adjusted his medals, his dignity intact despite the assault. "You've made a serious mistake today, son," the lieutenant said to Blake, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Do you have any idea of the consequences of assaulting a veteran at Arlington National Cemetery?" Blake's face had lost its drunken flush, replaced by a growing pallor as reality began to sink in. I didn't mean... It was just a joke." His words trailed off as he looked around, seeing his actions reflected in the faces of the gathered crowd. "A joke?" Torres's voice cut through Blake's stammering like a blade. "Let me educate you about where you're standing." His grip remained firm but controlled. "Every step we take here honors those who gave everything for this nation. That marble you scuffed with your expensive shoes? It's sacred ground, purchased with the blood of patriots." The military police officers moved to take custody of Blake, but Torres wasn't finished. His next words carried the weight of every guard who had ever walked the 21 steps. "The Sentinel's Creed," he began, his voice carrying across the now silent plaza. "My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted." Each word seemed to strike Blake like a physical blow. "In the responsibility bestowed on me, I will not falter, and under the eyes of God I shall prevent defacement or disgrace." Blake's legs seemed to wobble as the full impact of his actions began to register. The alcohol was wearing off, replaced by the cold sobriety of consequences. His eyes darted between Torres, the MPs, and the crowd, searching for any sympathy but finding none. "That man you attacked?" Torres continued, nodding toward Marcus. "Force Recon Marine. Lost the use of his legs, saving his entire unit from an ambush. Those medals you mocked? Each one represents sacrifice you couldn't begin to comprehend." Marcus wheeled himself forward, his presence commanding despite his seated position. "The guard isn't just a ceremony, son," he added quietly. "It's a promise to every service member, past and present, that their sacrifice will be honored and protected." The young lieutenant stepped forward, his dress uniform immaculate in the morning sun. "Mr. Blake, you're being detained for assault, desecration of a national monument, and disturbing the peace at a military installation. Your actions fall under federal jurisdiction." Blake's face crumpled as the reality of federal charges sank in. "Please, you don't understand. My father, he's the important person. He can make this right." His voice had lost all its previous arrogance, replaced by desperate pleading. "Make this right?" Torres's voice carried a sharp edge. "Some things can't be fixed with money or connections. Some disrespect can't be undone with a phone call." He finally released his hold, stepping back with perfect precision. "But perhaps you can learn from this." The military police moved in, their handcuffs reflecting the morning sun as they took custody of Blake. The crowd remained silent, witnessing justice being served with military efficiency. Several veterans nodded in approval, understanding the deeper significance of what they had just witnessed. "Wait," Blake called out suddenly, his voice cracking. He turned toward Marcus, his face showing the first genuine emotion since his arrival. I'm sorry, I never..." Marcus held up a hand, silencing Blake's stammering. "Sorry isn't just a word, son. It's an understanding. When you figure out what you're really apologizing for, then maybe you'll begin to grasp what this place truly represents." As the MPs began to lead Blake away, Private Torres returned to his post with the same measured precision that marked every aspect of his duty. 21 steps, turn, 21 steps. But now the crowd watched with new understanding, seeing beyond the ceremony to the deeper meaning it represented. The morning sun had risen higher, casting no shadows in which dishonor could hide. The scattered money still littered the ground, but now it looked small and meaningless against the marble that had witnessed so much sacrifice. A quiet dignity had returned to the plaza, stronger perhaps for having been tested and defended. The Arlington National Cemetery Visitor Center had been transformed into a temporary processing area, its usual quiet dignity now witness to the consequences of Blake's actions. The young man sat in a stark office, his designer suit wrinkled and stained, his handcuffed hands resting on a plain metal table. The morning sun through the window cast harsh light on his face, highlighting every trace of his fading arrogance. "Federal property," the investigating officer, Captain Sarah Martinez, stated flatly as she reviewed the charges. "Assault on hallowed ground, desecration of a national monument, disturbing the peace at a military installation." Each charge seemed to land like a physical blow. "The security footage is already being reviewed and we have dozens of witness statements and videos from visitors." Blake's attempt at his usual smirk faltered. "Look, clearly this has been blown out of proportion. My father's lawyer will be here soon and we can discuss an appropriate settlement." The word hung in the air, as hollow as his previous threats. Captain Martinez's expression remained unchanged. "Mr. Blake, you seem to be under the impression that this is a civil matter that can be resolved with money. Let me be very clear. You're facing federal criminal charges. This isn't something your father's checkbook can make disappear." Outside the window, the cemetery grounds stretched out in perfect rows, white headstones catching the morning light. A funeral procession moved slowly in the distance, the flag-draped coffin a stark reminder of the sacred nature of these grounds. "I've been authorized to show you something," Martinez continued, placing a folder on the table. "Your grandfather, General William Blake, Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars, bronze star with Valor device." She laid out the documents one by one. "He's buried here, Section 60, Row 1242. Blake's face lost what little color remained. What does my grandfather have to do with this?" "Everything." Martinez opened another file. "According to cemetery records, you've never visited his grave, not once in the 12 years since his interment. Yet this morning, you chose to dishonor everything he stood for, less than 100 yards from where he rests." The words seemed to hit Blake with physical force. His hands trembled slightly as Martinez placed a photograph on the table. His grandfather in full dress uniform, standing proudly before the very tomb he had just desecrated. "General Blake served as commander of the Old Guard," Martinez continued, "the same unit that guards the tomb today. He personally trained honor guards, including several who still serve. The soldier you mocked? He walks the same steps your grandfather once walked." Through the office window, the changing of the guard could be seen in the distance, the ceremony continuing with timeless precision despite the morning's disruption. Blake watched, really seeing it for the first time, his grandfather's connection giving the ritual new meaning. I didn't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Clearly." Martinez's tone was sharp. "You also didn't know that the Marine you assaulted, Master Sergeant Chen, served with your grandfather in Desert Storm. He was there when your grandfather earned his last silver star, saving his entire command from an ambush. Blake's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions finally seeming to reach him. Does he know? Master Sergeant Chen, I mean. Does he know who I am? He knew exactly who you were, Martinez confirmed. He recognized your family resemblance immediately. That's why he tried to handle the situation quietly to spare your grandfather's reputation. And how did you repay that respect? The silence stretched out, broken only by the distant sound of taps being played at the funeral. Blake's eyes were drawn to the ceremony through the window, seeing now what he had been too drunk and arrogant to notice before. The precision, the dedication, the honor in every movement. The guard who stopped you, Martinez continued, Private First Class Torres. He's not just a ceremonial soldier. Army Rangers, 2 tours in Afghanistan, Bronze Star recipient. He stands that watch not because he has to, but because it's one of the highest honors in the military. She placed one final document on the table, a letter in familiar handwriting. This was found in your grandfather's personal effects after his passing. It's addressed to you. Blake's hands shook as he reached for the envelope, but Martinez pulled it back. You haven't earned the right to read it yet. Your grandfather wrote this believing his grandson would understand the meaning of honor, of sacrifice, of respect. The man we saw this morning, he wouldn't recognize that person as his grandson. Through the window, the funeral procession had reached its destination. The flag was being carefully folded with ceremonial precision, each movement a testament to the traditions Blake had mocked. The sound of rifles firing in salute carried across the grounds, making him flinch. So here's what happens now, Martinez stated, gathering the documents back into their folders. You're going to be processed and charged, but before that you're going to sit here and watch that funeral. You're going to watch those guards perform their duty. And you're going to start understanding exactly what it means to dishonor not just this place, but your own family's legacy. Blake's eyes remained fixed on the funeral ceremony, seeing for the first time the weight of tradition, of sacrifice, of honor that permeated every inch of these grounds. The magnitude of his actions was finally beginning to dawn on him, bringing with it a shame deeper than any legal punishment could inflict. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the visitor center's windows as Blake continued his vigil. He had watched 3 more funerals, each one driving home the reality of where he was and what he had done. His expensive suit, now wrinkled and stained, seemed like a costume, a shallow attempt at importance in a place of genuine significance. The door opened, and Master Sergeant Chen wheeled himself in, accompanied by Private First Class Torres, now relieved from his guard duty. Blake instinctively tried to stand, but the handcuffs reminded him of his situation. The contrast between his restraints and Chen's wheelchair wasn't lost on him. One a consequence of dishonor, the other a mark of sacrifice. Your grandfather saved my life, Chen began without preamble, positioning his wheelchair across the table. Desert Storm, 1991. Our unit was pinned down, taking heavy fire. The general led a counterattack himself, exposed to enemy fire to create an evacuation route. He didn't have to. He could have called in support from a safe position. But that wasn't who he was. Blake's throat tightened. These weren't the sanitized war stories his father had occasionally shared at holiday dinners. This was real, raw history, connected to the very man he had assaulted. When I recognized you this morning, Chen continued, I saw his features in your face, the same jaw, the same eyes, but none of his character. The words cut deeper than any physical blow. I tried to handle it quietly, to spare his memory the shame of seeing his grandson acting like a common thug on the very grounds he held sacred. Torres moved to stand at parade rest near the window, his presence a reminder of the morning's events. The Tomb Guard badge, he spoke, his voice carrying the same authority it had during the incident, is the second least awarded badge in the military. Your grandfather earned his in 1970. He trained 3 generations of guards after that. Captain Martinez returned, carrying a worn leather journal. "We found this in the archives," she explained, placing it on the table. "Your grandfather's tomb guard logbook. Every guard keeps one, recording their thoughts, experiences, the meaning they find in their duty." With trembling hands, Blake opened the journal. His grandfather's familiar handwriting filled the pages, but these weren't the words of the stern military man he vaguely remembered. These were deep reflections on duty, honor, and the profound responsibility of guarding the nation's fallen. "Read page 47, Chen suggested quietly. The entry from April 15th, 1970. Blake turned to the page and began reading aloud, his voice shaking. "Today, I watched a mother collapse before the tomb, her son's body recently returned from Vietnam. Her grief was a physical force, but her pride in his sacrifice was equally powerful. We guard not just the unknown soldiers, but every parent's child who gave everything for our nation. My own son is due in 3 months. I pray he grows to understand the weight of sacrifice these marble walls witness daily. And if I'm blessed with grandchildren, I hope they too will grasp the sacred duty we uphold here." Blake's voice cracked on the last words. The weight of his grandfather's hopes, contrasted with his own actions, seemed to physically press down on him. "Your grandfather," Torres added, "established the enhanced training program we still use today. Every precise step, every exacting standard, his influence lives on in every guard who walks the mat. This morning, you didn't just disrespect the tomb. You disrespected his legacy." Through the window, another funeral procession approached in the distance. The mechanical precision of the honor guard, the careful handling of the flag-draped coffin, the grieving family following behind. Everything took on new meaning through the lens of his grandfather's words. "The letter," Blake said suddenly, looking at Martinez, "the one he wrote to me. Please. I need to understand." Martinez considered for a moment, then nodded. She retrieved the envelope from her folder and placed it before him. The handwriting on the front simply read, "For Blake, when you're ready to understand." With hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, Blake opened the letter. "My dearest grandson, if you're reading this, then something has brought you to Arlington, to these sacred grounds I've dedicated so much of my life to protecting. Perhaps you've come seeking understanding, or perhaps fate has guided you here for reasons of its own. These marble rows aren't just stones marking the departed. They're promises we make to every service member, that their sacrifice will be honored, their memory protected, their legacy preserved. The tomb guards don't just walk their posts to maintain tradition. They stand watch over America's soul, ensuring we never forget the cost of our freedom. You were just a child when I last held you, but I saw in you the potential for greatness, not the shallow greatness of wealth or status, but the deep greatness of character, of understanding what truly matters in this world. My fondest hope is that you'll grow to understand why these grounds are sacred, why this duty is eternal, why this sacrifice demands our ultimate respect. The true measure of a person isn't in their victories or possessions, but in their understanding of what's worth protecting. With eternal love and hope, your grandfather, General William Blake." The letter trembled in Blake's hands as the full weight of his actions crashed down upon him. Through the window, the funeral procession had reached its destination, the honor guard preparing to render final honors to another fallen hero. The letter lay on the table between them, its pages already showing wear from Blake's trembling hands. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting longer shadows across Arlington's hallowed grounds. In the distance, the steady rhythm of 21 steps continued unbroken, as it had for decades before, and would for decades to come. "I want to make this right," Blake finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The arrogant young man from the morning was gone, replaced by someone beginning to understand the true weight of his actions. "I know I can't undo what I did, but there has to be something." Master Sergeant Chen studied him carefully, decades of military experience allowing him to read the sincerity in Blake's changed demeanor. "Making it right isn't about a single gesture," he said finally. "It's about understanding, truly understanding, what these grounds represent." Captain Martinez opened another file on the table. The federal charges are serious, she stated matter-of-factly. However, given the circumstances and your grandfather's service, we've been authorized to offer an alternative to immediate prosecution. Blake straightened in his chair, desperate hope showing in his eyes. Torres shifted his stance slightly, his presence a reminder of both authority and possibility. Arlington National Cemetery has a restoration and maintenance program, Martinez continued, usually staffed by volunteers who understand the sacred nature of their work. We're offering you the chance to join them, not as some cushy community service, but as a genuine opportunity to learn what your grandfather tried to teach you through that letter. The work is hard, Torres added, his voice firm. Every headstone must be cleaned by hand, every blade of grass must be perfect, every ceremony must be given total respect. The standards are absolute as they should be for hallowed ground. Blake nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. How long? 6 months, Martinez replied. Full time. You'll work under the direct supervision of our grounds crew. You'll learn the history of every section, the meaning of every ceremony. You'll assist in maintaining the grounds to the exact standards your grandfather helped establish. And most importantly, Chen added, you'll witness what happens here every day. The funerals, the families, the final honors rendered to our fallen. You'll learn why we guard this place with such dedication. Through the window, another funeral procession moved with solemn precision across the grounds. Blake watched as the honor guard executed their duties with flawless precision, seeing now what he had been too blind to recognize before. Additionally, Martinez continued, you'll spend time with our visitor education program. Not speaking, you haven't earned that right, but learning. Understanding why school groups come here, why veterans make pilgrimages, why families find solace in these grounds. The tomb guard, Torres added, his bearing professional but slightly softer than before, maintains a small museum. Your grandfather's badge and journal will be added to the collection. Part of your duties will include helping maintain that space, learning the stories of those who walked the 21 steps before you were born. Blake's eyes were drawn to the worn leather journal still lying on the table. And my grandfather's letter? That stays with the family, Chen answered. But its lesson, that's something you'll need to earn through your actions here. There's one more condition, Martinez stated, her tone serious. You'll need to formally apologize not just to Master Sergeant Chen and Private First Class Torres, but to Arlington itself, to the sacred ground you desecrated, to the memories you dishonored, to the traditions you mocked. Blake nodded, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. Not just an alternative to prosecution, but a chance at redemption, at understanding, at honoring his grandfather's legacy rather than disgracing it. The choice is yours, Martinez concluded. Accept these terms and commit to genuine change, or face the federal charges as they stand. Either way, your actions will have consequences. The only question is whether those consequences will lead to understanding or just punishment. Through the window, the funeral procession had reached its destination. The honor guard began the precise ritual of folding the flag, each crisp movement laden with meaning that Blake was only now beginning to grasp. Before you decide, Chen added quietly, look out there. Really look. Those aren't just ceremonies you're watching. Those aren't just stones you see. Each one represents a story of sacrifice, of duty, of love for something greater than oneself. That's what your grandfather protected. That's what you dishonored. And that's what you have a chance to finally understand. Blake stood slowly, moving to the window with permission from Martinez. He watched as the folded flag was presented to a grieving widow, saw her tears, saw the honor guard's perfect salute. For the first time in his life, he began to truly see what his grandfather had tried to teach him about duty, about respect, about the sacred nature of service and sacrifice. I'll do it, he said finally, his voice firm despite his tears. Not to avoid punishment, but because I need to understand. Because he would have wanted me to understand. The afternoon sun caught the endless rows of white marble headstones, each one a testament to sacrifice, each one a story of service. Somewhere out there, in Section 60, row 1242, his grandfather's stone stood among them, no longer just a marker he had ignored, but a challenge to become the man his grandfather had hoped he would be. Dawn broke over Arlington the next morning, finding Blake already at work. His designer suit had been replaced by simple work clothes, his manicured hands protected by work gloves as he learned the proper technique for cleaning headstones. Each marker required specific care, precise movements, approved materials, careful attention to detail. Gentle circular motions, instructed James Henderson, the grounds supervisor who had maintained these sacred acres for over 3 decades. Every stone tells a story. Every name deserves respect. His weathered hands demonstrated the technique again, showing the care that came from years of understanding the meaning behind the work. Blake's muscles, unused to physical labor, protested as he worked. The morning dew soaked through his pants as he knelt before each stone, but he didn't complain. The physical discomfort seemed appropriate, a small price to pay for his previous disrespect. "Sir," he called to Henderson, pointing to a dark spot on one marker. "This stain won't come out." Henderson knelt beside him, examining the stone. "That's not a stain, son. That's where visitors have touched the name, year after year. Family members, battle buddies, people who come to remember. Those marks? They're memories made physical." The revelation hit Blake hard. What he had mistaken for imperfection was actually a testament to love, to remembrance, to connections that survived beyond death. He thought of his grandfather's stone, untouched by his own hands for all these years. As the morning progressed, more cemetery workers arrived. Blake noticed how they all worked with the same careful precision, the same quiet respect. Many were veterans themselves. Others were civilians who understood the sacred nature of their duty. None of them treated it as just a job. "Every morning," Henderson explained as they moved to another section, "we check every stone, weather damage, shifting soil, anything that might detract from the honor these markers represent. Your grandfather used to do this too, you know." Blake looked up, surprised. "He did?" Henderson nodded, adjusting a small American flag that had tilted slightly beside a nearby stone. After he retired, he'd come out here early mornings. Said maintaining these grounds was another way of serving. He particularly loved teaching young people about the meaning of this place. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both look up. Master Sergeant Chen wheeled himself along the path, accompanied by Private First Class Torres, now in his daily uniform rather than his guard dress. "How's he doing?" Chen asked Henderson, though his eyes were on Blake. "Learning," Henderson replied simply. "Sometimes the hardest lessons start with the simplest tasks." Blake stood, wiping sweat from his forehead, acutely aware of how different he must look from the arrogant young man of yesterday. Chen wheeled closer, examining the stones Blake had cleaned. "Your grandfather," Chen said, "used to say that caring for these grounds was a prayer of sorts. Each stone cleaned, each blade of grass trimmed. It's all a way of saying, you are not forgotten." Torres moved to stand before a nearby headstone, his posture perfect even in regular uniform. "The tomb guards have a saying," he added, "time will not dim the glory of their deeds, but it takes dedicated hands to ensure that promise is kept." In the distance, the morning's first funeral procession appeared. Blake watched as the caisson moved with measured steps, the flag-draped coffin a stark reminder of ongoing sacrifice. Henderson gestured for him to stop working. "We pause," Henderson explained quietly. "Every time a funeral passes, we stop. We stand. We honor. This isn't about efficiency or schedules. It's about respect." They stood in silence as the procession passed. Blake noticed how every groundskeeper, every worker, every person on these acres stopped and stood in reverence. The morning sun caught the brass buttons of the honor guard, the polished wood of the caisson, the careful folds of the flag. "Your grandfather understood something profound," Chen said as the procession moved on. "These grounds aren't just about death. They're about life, about how we choose to honor those who gave everything for something greater than themselves. Blake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He turned back to his work, approaching the next headstone with new understanding. Each name he uncovered, each date he cleared of dirt, each story he helped preserve. It all meant something more now. "There's someone who'd like to meet you," Henderson said after a while. "She's been coming here every Tuesday for 40 years. Her husband earned the Medal of Honor in Vietnam. She tends his stone herself, but age makes it harder now." As if on cue, an elderly woman appeared on the path carrying a small bag of gardening tools. Her back was bent with age, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "Mrs. Reynolds," Henderson called gently. "This is Blake. He's learning about the meaning of these grounds. Would you tell him about Thomas?" The woman looked at Blake, seeing past his work clothes and dirty hands to something deeper. "Thomas," she began, her voice strong despite her years, "believed that honor wasn't about recognition. It was about doing what's right, especially when no one was watching." Blake felt the weight of her words, understanding that his own journey toward honor was just beginning. The morning sun continued its arc over Arlington's sacred ground, illuminating endless rows of white marble, each stone a story, each story a lesson in what truly matters. Weeks passed, marked by the rhythm of dawn arrivals and dusk departures. Blake's hands, once soft from a life of privilege, had grown calloused from daily work. His designer clothes hung untouched in his closet, replaced by sturdy workwear that bore the honest stains of labor. But the real changes ran far deeper than the physical. Today found him kneeling before a section of headstones, carefully removing fallen leaves, while a school group gathered nearby. He could hear Henderson explaining the significance of the grounds to the young students, his voice carrying the same reverence it had shown since Blake's first day. "Every stone has a story," Henderson was saying. "Every name represents a life given in service to our nation." The children listened with unusual attention, sensing the solemnity of the place even if they couldn't fully understand it yet. Blake looked up as a familiar whirring sound approached, Master Sergeant Chen's wheelchair. Over the weeks, Chen had become a regular presence, offering guidance that went far beyond supervision of Blake's mandated service. "Your grandfather," Chen began, positioning his chair near where Blake worked, "used to do exactly what Henderson's doing now. He believed teaching young people about sacrifice was as important as maintaining these grounds." Blake nodded, remembering the journal entries he'd been studying during his breaks. Each page revealed more about the man he'd never truly known in life. "He wrote about that," Blake replied softly. "Said that these stones speak to the living, if we're willing to listen." A movement caught their attention. Private First Class Torres approaching with a group of new Tomb Guard trainees. They paused near Blake's position, Torres's voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "The mat we walk," Torres explained to his charges, "has been worn by the steps of guards who came before us. Your duty isn't just to the present, but to their legacy, to the standards they established." One of the trainees noticed Blake and whispered something to Torres, clearly recognizing him from the incident that had made the news. Torres's response was measured but clear enough for Blake to hear. "Everyone who comes to Arlington has a chance to learn its lessons. Some learn through ceremony, some through service, some through sacrifice. The important thing is that they learn." The words struck Blake deeply. His own learning had come through shame, through the consequences of his actions, but it had come nonetheless. Each day spent tending these grounds had taught him something his privileged life never had. Mrs. Reynolds appeared on her usual Tuesday visit, moving slower now in the autumn chill. Without being asked, Blake gathered her gardening tools and walked with her to her husband's stone. It had become their routine. He would help with the heavy work, and she would share stories of Thomas. "He never talked about the medal," she said today, watching as Blake carefully trimmed the grass around the stone. "Said the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. Your grandfather understood that kind of humility." Blake's hand stilled on the shears. "I'm starting to understand it too," he admitted. "All those years I thought power came from money, from status, but real power is in service, isn't it? In putting something larger than yourself first." A funeral procession appeared in the distance. As always, all work ceased. Blake stood with Mrs. Reynolds, supporting her elbow as they paid their respects. The flag-draped coffin passed slowly, the honor guard's movements precise and dignified. "Look at their faces," Chen said quietly, having wheeled up beside them. The honor guard, the family, even the visitors who stopped to pay respect. Everyone here understands they're witnessing something sacred. Blake watched the procession, remembering how he had once mocked these same ceremonies. Now each movement carried meaning. Each gesture spoke of honor and sacrifice. The change in his perspective was so profound, it almost took his breath away. "Your grandfather," Chen continued, "once told me that Arlington isn't just about remembering the dead. It's about teaching the living. Every ceremony, every carefully maintained stone, every blade of grass, it all serves to remind us what truly matters." As the funeral procession passed, Blake noticed Torres standing at attention nearby, his bearing perfect even in daily uniform. Their eyes met briefly, and Torres gave a slight nod. Not quite approval, but acknowledgement of the change he'd witnessed over the weeks. "There's something I've been wanting to ask," Blake said, turning to Chen. "That day, when He still struggled to speak of his actions. "You knew who I was, knew about my grandfather, but you still tried to handle it quietly. Why?" Chen was silent for a moment, looking out over the endless rows of white marble. "Because your grandfather believed in the power of redemption. He understood that sometimes the greatest honor we can show our fallen is to help the living find their way back to what's right." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds as they spoke. In the distance, the tomb guards continued their eternal vigil, 21 steps at a time. Blake thought about his own journey, from disgrace to understanding, from arrogance to humility. "Tomorrow," Henderson called as he approached their small group, "we're helping prepare for a special ceremony. Medal of Honor recipient, World War II veteran. His last request was to be buried near his unit." He looked at Blake thoughtfully. "I think you're ready to assist with the preparation." Blake felt the weight of this trust, this responsibility. Each day brought new lessons, new understanding of what these grounds truly represented. His grandfather's words from the journal echoed in his mind. "Honor isn't inherited. It's earned through actions, through understanding, through service to something greater than ourselves." The day of the Medal of Honor recipient's funeral dawned clear and cold. Blake arrived earlier than usual, the stars still visible in the pre-dawn sky. He found Henderson already there, reviewing the precise requirements for this special ceremony. "Everything must be perfect," Henderson explained, handing Blake a detailed checklist. "Captain Michael Reynolds, 101st Airborne. Survived D-Day, earned his medal saving his entire platoon at Bastogne. He was the last surviving member of his unit." As they worked to prepare the site, a familiar voice caught Blake's attention. "Well, look who it is. The famous Arlington troublemaker." Blake turned to find Richard Sterling, another trust fund heir he'd once considered a friend, stumbling toward them. The smell of expensive scotch, Blake's own former drink of choice, preceded him. "Heard you'd gone native," Sterling continued, his words slurring slightly. "Trading in your Armani for work clothes, playing janitor at a cemetery. Your father's beside himself, you know." Henderson stepped forward, but Blake raised a hand. "I've got this," he said quietly. 3 months ago, he would have been right there with Sterling, drinking and mocking what he didn't understand. Now, the contrast between his past and present self couldn't have been starker. "This isn't just a cemetery, Richard," Blake replied calmly. "And I'm not playing anything. I'm serving, learning, trying to understand what real honor means." Sterling laughed, the sound harsh in the pre-dawn quiet. "Honor? Please. You sound like one of them now." He gestured dismissively toward a group of arriving veterans. "What's next, enlisting? Trading in your trust fund for dog tags?" Before Blake could respond, he noticed Master Sergeant Chen approaching, accompanied by Private First Class Torres. They had come early to pay their respects to Captain Reynolds, their presence a reminder of the day's significance. "You should leave," Blake said firmly to Sterling. This isn't the place for this conversation. We're preparing for a Medal of Honor recipient's funeral. Show some respect. Respect? Sterling stumbled closer, reminding Blake uncomfortably of his own behavior months ago. For what? Some old soldier's fancy burial? Come on, Blake. This isn't you. Come back to the real world. Blake felt a familiar anger rising, but it was different now. Not the entitled rage of his past, but a protective instinct for this sacred place and what it represented. The real world? He repeated quietly. I've learned more about the real world here than I ever did in our privileged bubble. Sterling's face darkened. They've really brainwashed you, haven't you? All this ceremony and tradition, it's just theater for tourists. These guards, these stones, these ceremonies. That's enough. Blake cut him off, his voice carrying an authority he'd never possessed before. 3 months ago, I was just like you. Ignorant, disrespectful, thinking money made me important. I was wrong, dead wrong. He gestured to the surrounding grounds, now brightening with dawn's approach. Every stone here represents sacrifice you and I can barely comprehend. That Medal of Honor recipient we're burying today? He threw himself on a grenade to save his men. My grandfather, who I never truly knew or understood, dedicated his life to protecting what this place represents. Chen and Torres had drawn closer, but they held back, watching Blake handle the situation. Henderson stood ready to intervene if needed, but his expression showed pride in his student's transformation. You want to know what the real world is, Richard? Blake continued, his voice steady. It's not our trust funds or our family names. It's the reality that people like Captain Reynolds faced at Bastogne. It's the sacrifice these stones represent. It's the honor these grounds protect. Sterling swayed slightly, something in Blake's words seeming to penetrate his drunken haze. You really believe all this, don't you? You've actually bought into this whole military honor thing? I don't just believe it, Blake replied. I'm living it, learning it, every day. And right now you're disrespecting everything this place stands for, just like I did once. The difference is I was given a chance to learn from my mistake. He stepped closer to his old friend, speaking quietly but firmly. So, I'm giving you that same chance now. Leave. Sober up. Come back when you're ready to show proper respect. Because if you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have to report you to cemetery security. And trust me, they take their duty to protect these grounds very seriously. Sterling stared at him for a long moment, seeing something in his former drinking buddy that seemed to shock him into partial sobriety. Without another word, he turned and stumbled toward the exit. As Sterling's footsteps faded, Chen wheeled forward. Well handled, he said simply. Your grandfather would have been proud. Torres nodded in agreement. You protected these grounds without escalating the situation. That shows real understanding. Blake turned back to his work, emotions churning beneath his composed exterior. I saw myself in him, he admitted quietly. The person I used to be. The person I never want to be again. The sun finally crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the endless rows of white marble. In the distance, the first notes of morning colors began to play. Blake stood at attention with the others, understanding now why his grandfather had found such meaning in these simple, profound ceremonies. Come on, Henderson said as the last notes faded. We have a Medal of Honor recipient to honor. Everything must be perfect. Blake nodded, returning to his preparations with renewed purpose. Each task, each detail was no longer just work. It was an act of service, a gesture of respect, a step further along the path of understanding his grandfather had hoped he would find. The morning sun climbed higher as final preparations for Captain Reynolds' funeral were completed. Blake stood back, reviewing every detail with Henderson. The grass had been perfectly trimmed, each nearby headstone meticulously cleaned, the ground immaculate. Even the air seemed to hold a special solemnity. Captain Reynolds' daughter is here, Chen announced, wheeling up to their position. She'd like to speak with you, Blake. Blake turned, surprised, to find an elderly woman approaching. Despite her age, she carried herself with military bearing, the daughter of a hero raised on values of service and sacrifice. Ms. Reynolds, Blake greeted her respectfully. I hope everything meets your father's standards." She smiled gently. "Master Sergeant Chen told me about you, about what happened 3 months ago and how you've changed since then. My father believed strongly in redemption, in the power of understanding to transform lives." Blake felt humbled by her kindness. "Your father's generation taught us all about courage and sacrifice. I only wish I'd understood sooner." "Understanding comes when it comes," she replied. "The important thing is that it comes at all." She looked out over the perfectly prepared grounds. "My father chose to be buried here, among his men. He said no honor could be greater than resting beside those who fought with him at Bastogne." In the distance, the funeral procession began to appear. The caisson moved with solemn dignity, the flag-draped coffin a bright contrast against the dark wood. The honor guard's movements were perfect, each step measured, each gesture precise. "Would you walk with me?" Ms. Reynolds asked Blake. "Father always said you truly understand Arlington when you walk its grounds with someone who knows its stories." As they walked slowly toward the ceremony site, she shared memories of her father. "He never talked about the medal," she explained. "Said the real medal was earning the respect of his men. Everything else was just medal and ribbon." They passed the section where Blake had first begun his work 3 months ago. The changes in the grounds mirrored the changes in himself, both transformed through dedicated service and growing understanding. Private First Class Torres approached, now in his full dress uniform. "The tomb guard will render honors as the procession passes," he informed them. "Your father's sacrifice will be acknowledged by those who stand eternal vigil." Ms. Reynolds touched Blake's arm gently. "Would you help me to my seat? These old legs aren't what they used to be." Blake offered his arm with a dignity he'd learned through months of service. As he guided her to her place, he noticed familiar faces in the gathering crowd. Veterans he'd met while working the grounds, families he'd assisted, even some of the schoolchildren who'd visited on tours. The ceremony began with perfect military precision. Blake stood at a respectful distance, watching as Captain Reynolds was given his final honors. The rifle volleys cracked across the morning air, each shot a reminder of sacrifice. The bugler's notes carried clear and true, speaking of service and rest. As the honor guard began the precise ceremony of folding the flag, Blake found himself remembering his grandfather's words from the journal. Each fold represents something precious: liberty, justice, sacrifice. When we present that flag, we're passing on a sacred trust. The folded flag was presented to Ms. Reynolds with careful dignity. "On behalf of a grateful nation," the words carried across the silent gathering. Blake saw in her face the same quiet strength he'd come to recognize in so many Arlington families: pride mixed with loss, honor tempered by sacrifice. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Ms. Reynolds motioned Blake closer. "My father would have appreciated the care you've shown these grounds," she said softly. "Not just the physical work, but the understanding behind it." Chen wheeled up beside them, Torres following close behind. "Understanding," Chen added, "is what transforms simple duty into sacred trust." 3 months ago, Blake admitted, "I wouldn't have understood any of this, the ceremony, the sacrifice, the honor. It would have all seemed like empty ritual." "And now?" Torres asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Blake looked out over the grounds he'd come to know so intimately. Each stone, each ceremony, each story of sacrifice. "Now I understand what my grandfather tried to teach me. That true strength isn't in wealth or status, but in service. That real power isn't about dominance, but about protecting what matters." Ms. Reynolds pressed something into his hand, a worn service medal. "This was my father's first bronze star," she explained. "Not his Medal of Honor, but in many ways just as meaningful. He earned it saving 2 young soldiers at Normandy. I want you to have it." "Ma'am, I couldn't possibly—" "You've earned it," she insisted. "Not through combat, but through understanding, through learning what these grounds represent, through becoming someone who truly honors their meaning." The afternoon sun caught the medal's tarnished surface, transforming it into something luminous. Blake held it carefully, feeling the weight of its history, its meaning. Your grandfather, Chen added quietly, would be proud of who you've become. Not because you've learned to maintain these grounds, but because you've learned why they matter. Blake looked at the medal in his hand, then out at the endless rows of white marble stretching to the horizon. Each stone a story, each story a lesson in sacrifice and honor. He understood now what his grandfather had tried to teach him, that true redemption comes not from avoiding consequences, but from learning their deeper meaning. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning when Blake's arrogance had led to his confrontation with the honor guard. Now, on his final official day of service, he stood before his grandfather's headstone in Section 60, Row 12, 42. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble, catching the carefully maintained brass letters of General William Blake's name. "Your service is technically complete," Captain Martinez said, approaching with Master Sergeant Chen and Private First Class Torres. "The federal charges have been suspended contingent on your continued understanding of what these grounds represent." Blake nodded, but his attention remained on the headstone. "I used to think this was just a stone with his name on it," he said quietly. "Now I understand it's so much more. It's a promise, a legacy, a challenge to be better." Henderson joined them, carrying a folder of papers. "We've received your application to continue as a volunteer groundskeeper," he noted, "even though your mandated service is complete." "If you'll have me," Blake replied. "These grounds, they've become more than just a place of service. They're where I finally understood what matters." Chen wheeled closer, examining the perfectly maintained area around the general's stone. "Your grandfather used to say that Arlington isn't just about remembering the past. It's about shaping the future. Each person who comes here has the opportunity to learn, to understand, to grow." A group of schoolchildren appeared on a nearby path, their teacher speaking quietly about the meaning of sacrifice and service. Blake watched them, remembering his own journey from ignorance to understanding. "Those kids," Torres observed, "they're at the age where values take root, where they start to grasp what words like honor and sacrifice truly mean." Blake's hand unconsciously touched Captain Reynolds's bronze star, which he now carried as a daily reminder. "Permission to speak with them?" he asked Henderson. "Not to share my shame, but to help them understand what I've learned?" Henderson nodded, and Blake approached the group. The children looked up at him with curious eyes as their teacher paused the tour. "See these stones?" Blake began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Each one tells a story of sacrifice, of service, of putting something larger than yourself first. My grandfather rests here among heroes, and it took me far too long to understand what that truly means." The children listened intently as Blake shared what he'd learned, not through lectures or lessons, but through months of service and growing understanding. He spoke of Captain Reynolds, of the daily honors rendered, of the sacred trust these grounds represented. "Sometimes," he concluded, "the greatest honor we can show our heroes is to learn from their example, to understand that true strength isn't in what we take from the world, but in what we give back to it." As the group moved on, Martinez approached Blake again. "There's something else we'd like to discuss," she said. "The cemetery's education program needs someone who can bridge the gap between civilian life and military service. Someone who understands both worlds and can speak from personal experience about the transformation these grounds can inspire." Blake looked at her in surprise. "You're offering me a position?" "Part-time to start," she confirmed. "Working with school groups, helping them understand what these grounds represent. Your grandfather did similar work after his retirement. It would be fitting for you to continue that legacy." Chen added, "Your story, from disrespect to understanding, it has power. It can help others grasp what these grounds truly mean before they make the mistakes you did." The morning sun had risen fully now, illuminating Arlington's endless rows of white marble. In the distance, the tomb guards continued their eternal vigil, 21 steps at a time. Blake watched their precision, remembering how he had once mocked what he didn't understand. "6 months ago," Torres said, "you thought I was just playing statue. Now you understand that every step, every movement, every ceremony has meaning beyond the visible." Blake turned back to his grandfather's stone, kneeling to brush away imaginary dust from its already pristine surface. "I understand now, sir," he whispered. "I understand what you tried to teach me, what these grounds represent, what it means to serve something greater than yourself." Standing, he faced the group. "I accept the position," he said firmly. "Not because my debt is paid, it never truly can be, but because these grounds have more to teach and I want to help others learn their lessons before they learn them the hard way as I did." Henderson handed him a new ID badge, different from the temporary one he'd worn during his mandated service. "Welcome to Arlington's permanent family," he said. "Your grandfather always believed this place had the power to transform lives. You're living proof he was right." As they walked back toward the visitor center, Blake paused for one last look across the grounds. The morning light caught every facet of Arlington's solemn beauty: the perfect rows of white marble, the precisely maintained grass, the steady rhythm of the honor guard's steps. "From ignorance to understanding," Chen observed. "From disrespect to service. That's the true power of these grounds." "And the true meaning of honor," Blake added quietly, understanding finally complete. "Not in how we fall, but in how we rise. Not in what we take, but in what we give back. Not in who we were, but in who we choose to become." The bronze star in his pocket seemed to warm slightly, a reminder of lessons learned and promises made. Blake squared his shoulders and walked forward, ready to help others understand what had taken him so long to learn. That true respect isn't commanded, it's earned, and real honor isn't inherited, it's lived. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.